Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm here to look ahead to Newcastle United's home game against Wolverhampton Wanderers on Saturday afternoon. Huge game for Newcastle and Wolves in the chase for European football. Wolves now ahead of Newcastle in the table after their recent results, and Gary O'Neill's done a fantastic job there off the back of getting sacked by Bournemouth. Everybody knows that was a harsh decision, a decision that Bournemouth might say that they've done that was made correctly because Andoni Iraiola's come in and done a fantastic job there. But you can't criticise Gary O'Neill's work. He's been absolutely superb at Wolves, really created a very together feeling at Wolves, and they're very good at sitting deep and hitting teams on the counter-attack. They've won at Spurs, they've won at Chelsea. They are going to be a really tough opposition for Newcastle to face at a time when St James's Park is not the fortress of old. It's really difficult to see how they go into this game with real confidence, because they, as I said against Blackburn the other day in my review of that game, they really just weren't at it again. It was a poor performance, lacking a sense of togetherness that Wolves have, but also Newcastle had last season. It's just they are not the same team at the moment as they looked back then, and that's a real worry, especially when they come up against a team like Wolves, who are everything, as I've said, that Newcastle aren't embodying at the moment. There are a few injury problems for Wolves in terms of Hwang Hee-chan, their top scorer, picked up a hamstring injury in their FA Cup victory against Brighton the other day. That's a boost if he can't play, and Matheus Cunha off the left has possibly got an injury as well. Both of those players missing would be a huge boost for Newcastle. Pedro Neto, of course, against Dan Burn. Another example of how the same issues could possibly plague Newcastle once again if left unchecked. Well, Eddie Howe reacting the same way he did at Arsenal against Bukayo Saka and bringing Tino Livramento to try and deal with him. That didn't really work. I expected him to go to 5 at the back at Arsenal. I still think he'll play 4-3-3 in the same system. Perhaps Tino Livramento will come in to deal with Neto's pace, because Dan Burn has had issues with that all season, as we know, but particularly with Neto in that game. He came on, I think, if I remember correctly, back in October, and really tore him a new one at different points in the game, led to an equaliser. And if he hadn't popped his hamstring in that game, then I think Newcastle would have gone on to lose it. They came away with a point, which actually looks like a good result looking back now. At the time, it was quite frustrating. This one, I still think it'll be a draw again. This game's got quite a lot of history of finishing 1-1. Wolves have been a tough cookie to break down. Last season was a really defining victory on the run to the Champions League. It was the difference maker. It set them on the way to a really good run to get to the top 4. Miguel Almiron scoring late on after Isak scored. Hwang equalised. It was a really tough game for Newcastle, but it was so defining because it led them on to better things. Will this game do the same thing? Perhaps, but I think the problems are much deeper than they were back then, in terms of stylistically, in terms of personnel, fitness of players. There's no new injury concerns from Eddie Howe in his press conference this morning, but we've seen Sven Botman miss the game in midweek for a rest. I think he'll come back in. Joe Willock, is he fit enough to start again? I don't think so. I wouldn't start him 2 games in a row. Elliot Anderson isn't ready to contend in a major way, despite the fact that he came on against Blackburn, took a penalty in the shootout. So the team is gradually getting back to fitness. The treatment room isn't full anymore, but you have to wait for these players to find their best form. Again, we've seen that with Botman, we'll see it with Willock, and we'll probably see it with Elliot Anderson as well. Wolves, this is going to be a really tough game, as I've said. There should be a lot of trepidation around it, because they sit deep and cause teams to be frustrated, but at the same time hit on the counter extremely well through Neto, who plays on Burn's side. So the same issues could open up again. They've got a strong midfield with Tommy Doyle in there, with João Gomez in there as well. So it could be a very tough game for Newcastle if they aren't on it. But at the same time, Anthony Gordon stepped up during the week. Bruno Guimaraes has stepped up in recent weeks as well. Alexander Isak looks a little bit better, having played the last couple of games and come through them. So Newcastle are strong on paper enough to win this game, but I just think generally the sort of aura of St James's Park and the sort of sense of occasion that was there last season hasn't been there. We were talking about this on the True Faith podcast last night, previewing this game. it really feels like the end of that first phase of the journey, and now the expectation levels have risen. People I've seen on Twitter constantly saying that you can't look back to where they've come with perspective. I understand why you can't use that as a reason not to criticise the team when they don't play well now, but I think you should always keep it in mind, because the team, the club used to be soulless. The club used to have no hope. Now it does, and that means that every game should be raucous. The worst that'll happen this season is it'll end with a bit of a whimper. The best that can happen is they race to Europe and they really go for something. And over the last 2 years since the takeover, St James's Park has been rocking when there's been something to look forward to, something to aim for, whether it be avoiding relegation in that first 6 to 8 months, whether it be the Champions League last season. Now they can have that. They need that again. The atmosphere needs to be back to where it was, and I think the real need for that is to feel like there's a siege mentality in the air. Everyone's against us. That's how Newcastle have worked best in the past, and it sort of feels a little bit like recently the defeat against Nottingham Forest, the draws against Bournemouth and Luton at St James's. That aura of a battle and of something to fight for seems to have disappeared. And I understand to a degree why that is, because before then they hadn't lost other than to Manchester City, Arsenal and Liverpool at St James's Park. They've got to get that bite back at St James's, I think, and that's got us. There's no better time for that to start than this week, because Wolves are such a threatening side. It's such a difficult game. They're right in the same race that Newcastle were, and they've come from being a long way away from Newcastle for most of the season. So that shows their improvement, Newcastle's difficulties in recent weeks. But that doesn't mean that Newcastle can't win this game. I think it'll be a draw. A really, really good victory, like it did last season, could be the catalyst for something towards the end of the season. In the league and the FA Cup, obviously, there's Manchester City away, which is another really difficult draw, which is a massive shame, but not the end of the world. They can still get through that tie. It's not impossible. They'll be at the Etihad in a couple of weeks. Hopefully, I'll be there. I'm just waiting to hear back on that, but an update on that later. But yeah, there's a really, really big chance, I think, that if a victory in this game could really propel Newcastle to something towards the end of the season. One last line from the press conference I wanted to discuss is Eddie Howe really tackled his future face on because of links to Julian Nagelsmann, who's currently Germany manager, heading into the Euros. Not likely to be there after the tournament, but he's been linked in the German media with the Newcastle job. Newcastle are interested in him if they decide to sack Eddie Howe. I think that this is a story out of nothing. These sorts of things happen all the time. Do they like Julian Nagelsmann? I'm sure they do, because everybody likes Julian Nagelsmann. He's one of the best young managers in the world. If Eddie Howe wasn't there, he'd be an ideal choice to replace, but that does not mean that he will replace Eddie Howe in the summer. Eddie Howe has said that he is just not concerned. He's looking at it from his perspective of he is in charge, he's in the seat, and he dictates his own future. I think that's a really, really good point to make. I've voiced my concerns over the tactics and some of his decision makings recently, but I think he is absolutely the man for Newcastle. Deserves a chance to turn this round. Newcastle still see him as their long-term man. I think he will be here next season. I don't think Julian Nagelsmann is a threat to him. I don't think any manager is a threat to him at the moment. But certainly this Nagelsmann story's come from a very, very tenuous link, a very flippant link that I think is more just speculating on something that isn't there. It's adding something. Yes, Newcastle might like the look of Julian Nagelsmann, but Liverpool might look at Julian Nagelsmann and like him in the summer if they can't get Xabi Alonso to replace Jurgen Klopp. It's that sort of thing that at this stage that is nowhere near where Newcastle are. They are not on the verge of any decision on Eddie Howe in terms of sacking him. They absolutely back him. I would not even give this the time of day. No chance that Eddie Howe is sacked in the next few weeks, at least to the end of the season. I think depending on how that goes, whether there's a change in the summer, would have something drastically wrong would have to go towards the end of the season, I think. But I don't see Julian Nagelsmann, this story, as being anything other than tabloid fodder, if I'm honest. I don't see how this is something for Eddie Howe to be threatened by. He clearly isn't, and that's a really, really positive sign for everybody involved. As I say, huge game on Saturday. Massive chance for Newcastle to really kickstart their season in the Premier League. They should have Sven Botman back. They could have Joe Willock in there as well. Elliot Anderson less likely, but Alexander Isak should be fit enough to start up front, which is absolutely brilliant news. Thank you very much. I'll be back on Sunday to look back at this result. If you like this sort of thing, please like, share and subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.